Very nice to see all of you this morning. My name is Raga. I'm the director of the OECD Development Centre, and I'm very happy to see so many of you. You might be wondering why we have such a big room. I don't know if it's a sort of a poison gift or a blessing in disguise. We of course would like to fill it, but the truth is that the room that we booked had some sound problems, so late last night we got the call that we have this wonderful room, and it's very nice to see a lot of you here, as we expected, and focused to be here in the middle, so it looks very, very good seen from here. But we have a full day ahead of us here today, and I warn you, you're going to see a lot of me. I saw the agenda now, and there's a lot of Raga in it, so I hope you bear with me. We are here, and I'm very pleased again to welcome you to this policy dialogue on domestic revenue mobilization, progress and challenges. And I would want to start by warmly thanking the United Nations University's World Institute for Development Economics Research, UNU-WIDER as we know it, and the University of Manchester for their collaboration in organizing this event. And I want to also welcome, in addition to you who are here, to our participants online. The topic that we're addressing could not be more timely or important. Across emerging markets and developing economies, fiscal space is tightening, just as development needs are growing. Development cooperation budgets are under pressure, external borrowing has become more expensive, and many countries are grappling with the economic legacies of recent global shocks. At the same time, the ambition of the Sustainable Development Goals are as urgent as ever. One case in point, the SDG financing gap in developing countries is estimated at more than $4 trillion per year. Closing this gap will not be possible without much stronger domestic resource mobilization, both in terms of public revenues and private capital. In this context, taxation plays a central role. Sustainable and predictable tax revenues are the backbone of state capacity. They pay for our schools, our health systems, and social protection, and they make long-term investment possible. And they underpin the social contract between government and citizens, which is a very important point that we will be discussing here today. Yet, in many countries, tax to GDP ratios are insufficient to meet these needs. And that is why strengthening domestic revenue mobilization requires a comprehensive approach through better tax policy design, more effective and transparent tax administrations, and reforms that broaden tax bases while ensuring fairness and equity. It also requires making better use of limited public resources and creating the conditions for private investment to contribute to the development goals. But tax reform is not only technical. It's deeply political and social as well. Progress depends on institutions, on trust, and of course on the willingness of citizens and businesses to comply with their obligations. Tax morale, accountability, and good governance are as important as tax rates and tax codes. Sorry, Ben, I'm looking at Ben from this tax directorate here at the OECD. I'm not undermining the tax codes or the tax rates, but this all comes together. Understanding these dynamics is essential if revenue systems are to be both effective and durable. And this is why today's discussion goes beyond tax systems. At its core, the conversation is about citizenship, democratic accountability, and how states build legitimacy through fiscal policy. And to bring this forward, we need to bring together rigorous research, comparative evidence, and country experience to shed light on how fiscal capacity develops, why tax systems differ, and how taxation shapes development outcomes. The UNU-WIDER project, the political economy of taxation, is a strong example of this approach, combining in-depth country case studies with cross-country and historical analysis. And it's going to be very interesting to hear about that, more of that today. Bringing that research into dialogue with policymakers and practitioners, creates exactly the kind of learning space that we need. Today's conversation also links into to the commitments made at the 4th UN Conference on Financing for Development in Sevilla last year, which places domestic capacity at the center of effective and sustainable revenue mobilization. This is precisely the focus of the OECD's work under the Sevilla Platform of Action on strengthening capacities for financing for developments. Turning those commitments into concrete actions at the country level will require precisely the kind of evidence-based dialogue that we are fostering here today. At the OECD, we are strongly committed to this agenda, and I am again glad to have here with us colleagues from the Center for Tax Policy and Administration, which leads much of this work and with whom the Development Center has a very close relationship. Through our work on revenue statistics, tax administration, tax morale, and investment policy, the OECD aims to help countries strengthen their capacity to raise and manage public resources. The guiding belief is simple: better data, better analysis, and stronger international cooperation leads to better policies. Today's objective is simple, but ambitious at the same time: to deepen our understanding of how domestic revenue systems can be strengthened, how reforms can be made politically feasible, and how taxation can better support sustainable development. I hope that today's dialogue will generate fresh ideas, new partnerships, and produce insights that help move this agenda forward in practice. I want to, on behalf of the organizers, thank you once again for joining us. I wish you all a very productive and engaging discussion. And now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Antonio Savoia from the Development Economics Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester for your opening remarks. Antonio, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good morning and thanks for coming here today. Thank you, Raga, for being here and introducing this event. It's a pleasure to come back to the OECD and to the Development Centre in particular. It's not the first time that I learn from my colleagues here, and at the same time I share findings from research that we do on various development issues. But today is about domestic revenue mobilization. Why? Why an event on this? In part, Raga has already said why this is important. Because it's an emerging consensus that strengthening domestic revenue mobilizations, or as we often call it, just DRM, is going to be an important revenue to fund the development goals. There is uncertainty about the development assistance landscape. Recent OECD research is forecasting a decline for 2025, and this follows a decline according to the OECD research that has already taken place in 2024. Not only that, borrowing is becoming more expensive and less attractive. So in this climate, domestic revenue mobilization becomes more important, and indeed emerged as a priority at the 4th United Nations Conference on Financing for Development last year in Seville. Looking back, when we set the Sustainable Development Goals, we see that actually domestic revenue mobilization was already there. It was part of SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 17, and emphasizing the need at target 17.1 to strengthen domestic resources mobilization. And how did we choose to measure this target? With two measures that emphasize DRM, domestic revenue mobilization, and taxation in particular. We measure target 17.1 with the total government revenue as a proportion of GDP, a measure that both the OECD, the tax colleagues here, and the UNU-WIDER colleagues produce now routinely for a large sample of countries. And we also measure target 17.1 with the proportion of the domestic budget funded by taxes. So domestic revenue mobilization, taxation in particular, generating tax revenues is important. This choice set years back on SDG 17 now turns out to be particularly timely in the current landscape of declining overseas development assistance. The evidence suggests that improving tax revenue collection, it's possible, it can happen. The challenge for us, or one of the challenges, is that many countries still collect a share of tax revenues in proportion to the GDP that is below 15%. This is what we often see today as a critical threshold, below which countries may struggle to provide the public services and public goods that support development. Universal education, public health systems, administration of justice, to give a few examples. What can we do about this? What can we do to improve policy analysis and design? Three things, essentially, at least three things. First, we should have a better assessment of the state of domestic revenue mobilization. How much progress have we seen globally and in less developed economies on this front? And what are the obstacles to further progress? We want to know more about at least these two questions. And capacity building initiatives, such as commitment on improving data and measurement, may ultimately be crucial to achieve further domestic revenue mobilization progress. Second, policy analysis and design require a better understanding of the political determinants of taxation. Another point that Raga mentioned. Taxation is about developing sophisticated administrative systems that ultimately may collect revenues from large tax bases. But compliance, tax compliance, is also political. You have to have a tax-paying citizenry willing to pay taxes. In other words, tax morale is also important, not just the technical exercise, which is important, of building sophisticated tax administrations. And third, progress on domestic revenue mobilization is also about understanding a little bit more the political consequences of taxation. We learn from a variety of social scientists that taxation may come with a governance dividend. We start paying taxes, we get slightly annoyed, we put scrutiny on the government. that process may become a virtuous cycle where quality of government improves because we start paying taxes. But as this happened globally, everywhere, and what are the mechanisms? Is this happening, for example, in a key battleground for the Sustainable Development Goals, such as low-income economies in Africa? We want to know a little bit more on this. The UNU-WIDER project on the political economy of taxation, I've been part of it, and you will hear more on this shortly, has examined these three aspects that I've just mentioned. And at this point, I should express my gratitude to the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, NORAD, who funded this project. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to do this research. The fundings from the political economy of taxation project, some of which are on Africa, help us to understand a little bit more why ultimately there are still so large disparities in domestic revenue mobilization, where the advanced economies often collect more than double the share in tax revenues over GDP compared to many developing economies. And it's a project that complements very nicely already a lot of research on tax and development that takes place here at the OECD and covers aspects such as public revenue data, tax administration, and tax morale. So, and I am about to conclude, it is this common interest that has brought us together today, the OECD Development Centre, my university, the University of Manchester's Global Development Institute, and UNU-WIDER, has brought us here to organize this policy dialogue. The objective is to get together partners, academia, policymakers, and debate, and ultimately have as I'm sure it will be, a fruitful day learning from each other. And last, this event should also be seen as a contribution to the Seville Platform for Action initiative related to the call to action, strengthening capacities for financing for development and future of data, by demonstrating how better revenue data and diagnostics, combined research on a variety of issues such as tax morale and governance can inform capacity building and policy design in partner countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Antonio. And coming from a country that is one of the, probably the champions of high taxation, Iceland, I can share the annoyance bit a little bit, but at least, and this is what we're going to be discussing today, at least we get a lot for our tax revenues, and this is what makes us accept it in the end. But without further ado, I would like to welcome to the stage Mr. Kunal Sen, who is our good partner and friend of the Development Centre, and he's from the UNU-WIDER, and he will now give us the key findings from the publication that I mentioned here earlier, The Political Economy of Taxation. The floor is yours.
Wait till the slides are up, so maybe a minute or so. So I want to start off while the slides are there it is. I want to start off saying that it's a real pleasure to be here because with the OECD Development Centre, Raga and colleagues, and the tax groups here in OECD, we go back a long way. We go back a long way because we've been working on this shared agenda on taxation for well over, I would say, almost 7, 8 years. And it's almost like homecoming here for us, for Manchester, and for us in UNU-WIDER, because when you come here, we feel like we are in a situation with colleagues who actually understand the kind of issues that we want to bring up, which is not just about improving tax administration, it's also about understanding the politics behind it. And I think it's something that we both share in the OECD and the UNU-WIDER and also the University of Manchester. And this particular project we did, I'm going to present you key findings. It's something that we want to pursue this particular angle, that how does tax morale, how does political considerations, all of these things have an effect on the way citizens pay taxes. Because that's something really important at the end of the day. What is it that makes them willing to pay taxes in return for better public services and so on? So in this project, which is a project that I co-led with Antonio Salva, of course, as we already discussed in the opening remarks, we are in a situation where developing cooperation projects are facing an uncertain future. That's actually an understatement, I think. And DRM, in short, domestic revenue mobilization, is a critical avenue to finance development goals. We heard this from Raga, we heard it from Antonio, there's absolutely no question about it. And DRM has also emerged as a priority at the UN FFD4 conference in Sevilla, as we heard also earlier in the opening remarks. And taxation is such an important fundamental part of how states finance critical development goods, particularly around public goods, particularly around the achievement of the 2030 agenda and SDGs. But then when you think about this, and then you see this particular graph here, which is showing non-resource tax over GDP over about 30 odd years, you find it actually of quite significant concern that the two regions that have high tax over GDP, that's Europe and Central Asia and North America, are right up there at around 25% of GDP. And then we have in the middle, Latin America and the Caribbean, the Middle East and North Africa, and East Asia. And right at the bottom of this graph, you see South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So the first point here is the difference between the top two performers, tax over GDP, non-resource tax over GDP, and those at the lower level of this graph, that gap has not reduced, number one. Number two, also you see, and this is also a worrying trend, that Sub-Saharan Africa actually saw improvement in tax over GDP till about 2015. So this just predates COVID actually. And that after 2015, we seem to see a decline in non-resource tax over GDP. And that's something that we need to think about, and something we'll talk about in this particular presentation. So these are things we have to think about, that why is it that we are not yet in a situation where the gap between the high taxes and the low taxes is not closing, even with so many years of trying to improve domestic revenue mobilization in Africa and in South Asia. So what we did in this project is that we looked at three things, and it was mentioned by Antonio earlier. So we're going to look at essentially first, just understanding where are we on domestic revenue mobilization. How much progress have we seen globally and in developing countries in particular? So that's the first question that we're going to answer. Second question we're going to answer is trying to understand what is it that determines tax morale. When are citizens more willing to pay taxes? After all, why should they pay taxes if they don't get something in return? And what is it that drives this particular state-citizen relationship where they're willing to pay taxes because possibly they get something in return? And the third, of course, is a very important question that we have been thinking about for a long time in this project, is about the governance dividend. Because taxation is not just about tax, it's about creating effective states. The more taxes you can collect, the more stronger the state is, the more effective the state is. And so does the quality of government improve because the tax-paying citizenry subjects the state to increasing scrutiny? And this is a two-way relationship, because if you see governance improving, more accountable states, more effective states, because of paying higher taxes, the more willing you'll be willing to pay taxes because you're getting something in return. So these are the three questions we try to answer in this particular project. And so this project, what we did at the beginning, we decided to have an open call for papers, along with a few papers which we commissioned. We have about 10 papers altogether, and I'll try and present some snippets of findings from these papers. And the real question that we were trying to answer, as I said, is a fundamental policy question. Why, despite a large amount of effort to improve revenue collection in low and middle income countries, high income countries still, on average, collect more than double the share of total revenues than low income countries? That was a fundamental question we tried to answer. And of course, this work we did in this project complements, as was mentioned earlier, OECD's work in the area of tax and development. Many of our colleagues in the OECD work in this space are here, and covering aspects such as public revenue data, tax administration, and tax morale. So it nicely complements work that already has been happening in the OECD. So this particular project we did was not the first time we delved into these issues on political economy issues. We did an earlier project, which again was where we partnered with the OECD in a policy dialogue, where we looked at fiscal states. How do we create more effective fiscal states? So that came out of the several publications. We had a policy brief, how to support the emergence of effective tax systems. It's all on the UNU-WIDER website. And that's something that we felt we needed to add more value to the work with the current project. So, first question. How much progress have we made in DRM? And let me explain this particular two graphs to you, because they're quite startling, they're quite unusual. The first is the graph of all countries, and second of Sub-Saharan Africa. Let me explain what it's saying. It's saying that, let's look at Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, it's saying that if you are a country with a low initial tax over GDP, 1990, you are more likely to increase tax over GDP ratios more than a country that already had high taxation in the same region. And you can see in this particular graph, some countries have performed extremely well. Mozambique is an example. Given Mozambique's initial tax over GDP, Mozambique is an outlier. It's performed far more than what you might have expected, given its initial tax over GDP. And then you look at countries that are on the lower end of the scatter, below the regression line. There is Equatorial Guinea, there is Congo, there is Zimbabwe. So we see a lot of variation. Some countries have done very well in the last 30 odd years. Some have not done so well. So the point here is that we have seen progress. We should not take away the fact that we've seen progress, not only around the world, but particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa. But there are challenges in that we seem to see some countries still underperforming given their initial tax over GDP in increasing tax revenues. We need to understand why that's the case. That's the first finding. The second finding is a more complicated finding on tax morale. And let me take you to this slide one by one. First, important point of tax morale is it's shaped by the reciprocal benefits that taxpayers receive and the fairness of who pays, and ultimately with the dynamics of the state-citizen relationship. You cannot expect citizens to pay more taxes if you do not take into account the fairness of what you're doing in terms of taxes that you are imposing on your citizens. And you also have to understand that they are looking at the benefits that they get from paying taxes. As I said, better schools, better healthcare, better roads. So you need to understand what is it that they're going to get by paying more taxes. And if you don't understand that, then you cannot expect that citizens will pay more taxes. So that's important. And in that, also we see several other findings that are actually based on the papers that will be presented here today later on. One was that one paper talks about, in the case of digital taxation in Africa, who gets the benefits matter. So who actually benefits from, in this case, digital taxation, mobile money taxation matters. Second, tax burdens matter. There's a lot of debate now about taxing small and medium enterprises, especially in the informal sector. And this particular finding shows that you've got to be careful. If you keep on increasing taxes, there would be a point when they will start not paying taxes, compliance will fall. So in this particular paper, they see a threshold of 45%. It's where pretty much SMEs start thinking, well, why am I paying so much taxes? And then compliance falls. That's the second point in this area of work. And then, of course, also power and politics matter, shaping the tax bargain. This is particularly in the case of fragile states where we don't yet have, say, a tax capacity, and where obviously in that kind of context, there are revenue bargains between the state and the private sector, and this essentially shape the distribution of power within the state with lots of different groups in the state. That's in this case, in this particular case, this paper looks at Somalia. And then also, and perhaps not surprising, corruption institutions matter. Without credible measures to reduce corruption, why would citizens be willing to pay more taxes and report honestly? So we have to worry about that side of the tax bargain, that corruption and weak institutions may discourage citizens in paying more taxes. Let's now look at the third finding. Is there a governance dividend? And this is based on a work that we're doing, Antonio and I, with a colleague. And here we brought in a different angle to this work. We looked at capital income taxation and labor income taxation. Let me explain what these are. So capital income taxation is taxing corporate income, mostly. And labor income taxation is taxing payrolls, payroll taxes. And we find that actually what you tax actually has a different effect on governance. If you tax capital income, corporate income taxes, property taxes, wealth taxes, you seem to see an improvement in the rule of law. Because capital owners want to see better, stronger property rights, rule of law, that's what they're looking for. On the other hand, if you're going to tax labor income, you see a positive effect on democracy, because labor income, those who are paying taxes on labor income, want to see more redistribution going on. So you see a very different effect, and this tells us that we've got to worry about exactly who we're going to tax. And on this graph here on the left-hand side, you can see that in the case of rich countries, upper income countries, they will stop actually taxing capital income, and we know this. That's why you see very high inequality in upper income in richer countries. And they have been increasing more labor income taxation. In the case of lower income countries, lower middle income countries, we see, though there's a lot of variation in the diagram, as you can see, taxation of both capital income and labor income has been increasing. And as we're arguing, this may have very different effects on governance, depending on what you tax, which income you tax. So let me now conclude with some policy implications. First, policy implication, disparities in DRM. We are pleased to see that disparities are reducing since 1990. Still very slow, still very taking a long time, perhaps, as you saw in the first graph I showed you, but it is still significant. We are seeing countries which had very low tax or GDPs, the ratios in 1990, are the ones who are improving the most. Whether it's sub-Saharan Africa, whether it's across the world, we're seeing that happen, and that's a positive sign. Second, tax morale. So what can policymakers do on tax morale? Well, here are the following things they can do based on the work that we have done. Enhancing transparency, consistent enforcement, public communication on revenue use are critical to strengthen voluntary compliance. This is voluntary compliance. And sustain effective revenue mobilization. So these are things which policymakers can do. These are not that complicated. Be transparent. Be consistent in enforcement. Be clear about what you're doing with the revenue that you're obtaining. And that is what we find can lead to more voluntary compliance. This is what you want. Tax fairness is also very important. Citizens are very aware of how fair the taxes are. If they think the tax is not fair, it's unlikely they'll want to pay those taxes. And so specific design choices like earmarking revenues for local services or exempting small-scale users can significantly affect support. This is particularly the case in Africa, the work that we've been doing on digital taxation. We have someone who's been working on this here. And then finally, tax and the governance dividend. So when we think about fiscal reform strategies and we think about what's going to happen over the long run, we need to take into account that different countries follow different paths of political institutional development, depending on whether capital income or labor income is taxed. And there's argument either way. I mean, maybe you want to improve capital income taxation to improve the rule of law. Or maybe you want to increase more democratic societies by increasing labor income taxation. It's a choice you're making as a policymaker. Or it's not even an either or choice, you can do both. But it's so important to think about because the long-run effects of taxation is very important to understand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kunal, for setting the scene so well and get it to prep us for the discussion. And I would now like to turn to the second part of this event, which is two panel discussions with high-level representatives from international organizations, academics, and governments in two parts. We will start with the international organizations and the academic, and then we will have a distinguished panel of ambassadors here in the second half. So without further ado, I would like to invite to the stage, and thank you, Kumal, for presenting, Mr. Philip Carbo, who is the Director of Research and Planning at the National Revenue Authority of Sierra Leone. Yes, please. And Mr. Ronald Weiswa, he is a specialist applied research and statistics from the African Tax Administration Forum. Next, I would like to call Mr. Gregoire Rotagraziosi. He's the professor of economics at the University Clermont-Auvergne. That's a difficult word. Certi, CNRS, and a research fellow as well as Ferdi, at Ferdi. And next, I would like to call my colleague Ben Dickinson, who is the Deputy Director for the Center for Tax Policy and Administration from the OECD. And joining us online is Ms. Lucky Star Mianbasi. She is the Tax and Domestic Resource Mobilization Advisor in the Department for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry and Minerals from the African Union Commission. She, as I said, will be joining us online. I think I will just stand and talk. I have a better overview of the panelists here. As I said, we have the two panels, and just to give you the format, I will ask each panelist one question each. You have about 6-7 minutes for your answers, and following that, we will have a short final remarks from our panelists to capture the key takeaways, and hopefully, if the moderator does her job, we will have time for some Q&A with participation from the floor. So, let me begin with you, Philip. As I said, Director of Research and Planning from the National Revenue Authority of Sierra Leone. According to our latest revenue statistics report that we produce along with our colleagues from CDP, the tax to GDP ratio in Sierra Leone was 6.7% in 2023, up from 6.6% in 2022. But in comparison, the average for the 38 African countries within the revenue statistics in Africa was 16.1%. And this is evident that strengthening domestic research revenue mobilization is essential for Sierra Leone in order to finance development. But an equally important issue is to ensure that the additional revenue translates, as we've been discussing here and as was apparent in Kunal's presentation, that the additional revenue translates into improved public services and more accountable government. So my question to you is, when does stronger taxation translate into better government accountability and service delivery? And what institutional and political conditions are necessary for taxation to generate a genuine governance dividend? Over to you, Philip.
All right, thank you very much. It's a privilege for me to be here from Sierra Leone. And thankfully, the Excellency Kanjasisi is also here, meaning that Sierra Leone is actually in Paris, so I feel more confident. So thank you very much. So generally, yes, so you spoke about the tax to GDP ratio. It's been very low in Sierra Leone compared to even the regional average. But particularly it has been so because we rebased the GDP in 2023 and we went back as far as 2018, starting from 2018. We are almost like 16% of GDP in 2021. But after rebasing the GDP, it means the revenue to GDP ratio almost halved because there has been no rebase of the GDP since 2006. So after a long period when it was rebased, the GDP almost doubled, so which implies as the denominator, if the numerator, which is revenue, remains constant, then obviously you expect revenue to GDP ratio to drop. But that has created a lot of pressure on us, irrespective of whether it's rebasing or not. So wherever the Minister of Finance will go, his justification is that revenue to GDP ratio is very low in Sierra Leone. So the pressure is on the revenue administration. So obviously issues of stronger taxation and how they actually bring more accountability, these are things that are very important. So stronger taxation generally imply collecting taxes from people who have the capacity to pay, and then in a form that's driven by stronger enforcement, and of course, with the structure being progressive, and as well as international broadening of the tax base, as well as international cooperation. Now, when does this stronger taxation translate to better services and accountability? Simply, I would say, when it triggers a fiscal contract, or what you call a tax bargain. And so this is where negotiation comes in. So government should not just impose taxes on the people like that, which implies there should be some form of negotiation. There should be the platform for taxpayers to negotiate with the government in terms of the quality of the relationship. So here, it's about the quality of the relationship and not just about the revenue, amount of revenue being collected. So which implies when it comes to tax policy, the negotiation, the determination of the tax rates, the tax base, the new taxes, they have to be negotiated together with taxpayers. Similarly, in terms of tax administration, when new tax administration reforms are being rolled out, the revenue authority should not just sit and then come up with tax reforms that are not actually also negotiated with the taxpayers, because they better know what they want, and they also know how they want it driven. So these ones have to be negotiated. So the platform for negotiation of tax policy and tax administration, and when that happens, that's when you can say then stronger taxation is actually translating into more accountability. But then there are key tenets here to make that happen that actually determine how that should happen. And first is the fairness of who actually pays. So as a taxpayer, I have to be confident that those who are higher up there, those who have power, those who have and more, actually are not protected. It implies the enforcement perimeter should also extend to them. So as a smaller taxpayer, if I know the elephant is already captured in the tax net, enforcement goes there. So as an ant, obviously I have to comply. So therefore, ordinary taxpayers are likely to comply if the enforcement also extends to those who have more power and also those who earn more. And then second thing that also defines that relationship is administrative credibility. So which implies here that taxpayers actually work on their lived experiences, how they see the tax registration process, how they see the filing of tax returns, how they see the payment of taxes, and particularly here in terms of the appeal system. So something has to be credible. In the recent TADA that we did in Sierra Leone, the IMF actually conducted for Sierra Leone, even though we already have the structures in place for an appeal process, but yet they have not seen any objection case. So they are saying, well, probably the taxpayers do not think the appeal process is actually credible. So when that is not credible, then it affects the relationship. But then also, thirdly, it has to do with the complexity of the tax system. So for small and medium taxpayers, obviously the tax system is difficult. The path to compliance is actually difficult. It makes it difficult for them to actually comply. So the tax system should be simple. And lastly, the thing that defines that relationship is about visible public outcomes. The taxpayers, the public, should be able to see the visible outcomes. It doesn't mean if I invest 20 euros, if I pay 20 euros in taxes, I'm expecting services that are also 20 euros. But it implies the taxpayer should be able to see some public value from the taxes they are paying. So when that happens, that also improves the relationship. So on the second part of your question that talks about the political conditionalities, here also I've not read the work of the political economy work of UNU-WIDER. So probably what I'll say here is from the practitioner's point of view to corroborate or triangulate the findings that come from there. And here, the conditions here for the institutional and political conditions that are necessary for taxation to generate a genuine governance dividend. I'll start with a transparent fiscal governance. There should be transparent fiscal governance. So here, the citizens should be adequately informed, that's obvious. Government should be open about how they use their revenues. So this is all very important. And secondly, the other condition has to do with institutionalized dialogue with taxpayers. This should not just be ad hoc. So it should be regular, and it has to be regular, and it also has to be credible. Now in Sierra Leone, what our government has done recently, we have signed an MOU between government and of course the taxpayers in how we can negotiate the payment of taxes, but also how tax administration should be driven. So government has been represented by the Minister of Finance, by the Minister of Trade, as well as the tax authority. And then the taxpayers represented by the Chamber of Commerce. So this is what we are now implementing to ensure if tax policies are being designed, they have to also be cautious of what the taxpayers themselves need. So recently, last year, we had our Finance Act. So in the development of that Finance Act, we had to first contact the taxpayers, get their views, we had a draft, and then we had their views into it before actually finalized it. The other condition that is necessary is actually policy continuity and or what you can call institutional stability. So in the context of the MTRS, there's now the medium-term revenue strategies that are being rolled out by IMF in several developing countries. So here, it's about predictability of the tax policy and tax administration reforms. So in Sierra Leone, for instance, we have a 5-year MTRS from 2023 to 2027. So the tax policies that we have to roll out in the next 5 years, they are defined there. The tax administration reforms that we want to roll out in the next 5 years, they are defined there. So for the taxpayers, there's non-predictability. So in the next 5 years, they have already planned their project economics, that this is what we expect. Anything that deviates from there will affect the trust and then predictability. The other condition also is about political sponsorship for even-handed enforcement. So here, enforcement perimeter, as I said earlier, should also extend to those that are even higher up there. But perhaps more important is trust in government. That's an important attribute as well. So in terms of the design of exemptions, governments sometimes tend to provide exemptions indiscriminately to those that have more power, those that can lobby more. So for the lower class taxpayers, they are not at a disadvantage because they don't have the lobbying power to actually get indiscriminate exemptions. So beyond those that are already in the general law, most times government will also meet with private entities to negotiate contracts where taxes are actually exempted. So when that happens, it affects the trust relationship. And then also another thing has to do with prioritization of DRM over, okay, almost, I'll conclude. It's about prioritization of DRM over foreign aid. So what happens here, if a government depends too much on foreign aid, it implies you not hold your citizens responsible, or your citizens will not even be incentivized to even ask government for more resources, because with aid, it implies government has enough that's available. But what we have seen in Sierra Leone is that there has been no budget support from foreign aid for some years. So the dependence has been now on the revenue administration to provide as much as possible. So which implies government is now obliged to work with the taxpayers, because should they not comply, should they not cooperate, implies government will not be able to actually implement their project. There should be strong and independent political accountability mechanisms. So here, whether it has to be from audit service, it has to be from anti-corruption commission or from parliament. In Sierra Leone, what we have seen recently also is from civil society. We have seen think tanks and civil society organizations holding government responsible in terms of accountability of the contracts that they sign. They did that, BAN did it, for instance, for tax exemptions, and then also another IGR did it in terms of the contract they signed for which government is not gaining much from revenue as against what the private sector is getting. And finally, it's about the credible international cooperation for cross-border compliance. So here also, you just don't depend on domestic. If the domestic actors think that government is only focusing on domestic compliance, then it becomes an issue. But if they know the international companies are also being tracked in terms of what happens in cross-border operations, then that becomes also very important. So in essence, if these conditions that I've outlined, if they actually hold, then taxation becomes more of not only a financing mechanisms, it becomes a stable channel through which tax capacity, accountability, and service performance can improve together. So let me stop here for now.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry that I gave you the evil eye there and towards the end, but I just really want us to have a chance to have a conversation afterwards. But this checked in all of the boxes, and thank you very much for your interesting intervention, which leads very well into our next speaker, Mr. Ronald Weiswa, who is a specialist in the Applied Research and Statistics team of the African Tax Administration, the ATAF, which is a close partner of the OECD. And with building on everything that we've been talking about, sort of the beyond policy design, the effectiveness of tax systems ultimately, as we've repeatedly stated here, depends on citizens' trust, perception of fairness, and the everyday interactions between the citizens and tax administrations. And with a regional perspective, ATAF has unique insights into what shapes the taxpayer's behavior. So from your research, what are the factors that more strongly increases the citizens' willingness to pay taxes? And from the perspective of the African tax administrations, what, in your view, actually builds citizens' confidence that taxes are fair and are used well and fulfill everything that we have been outlining here today? Over to you.
Thank you so much again for inviting the African Tax Administration here. I'll share my experiences. First of all, based on my experience as a tax administrator in Uganda, but also my African continent experience working with the African Tax Administration. In the strict sense of the word, I think very few taxpayers and very few of us are naturally willing to pay taxes. That is my first opinion. And across most of Africa, I think what I observe is tax compliance is not really driven by civic enthusiasm or goodwill, in my view. It is driven by maybe other three factors which I'll briefly talk about. And the reason I say this is when you look at the statistics in terms of revenue contribution, most of the revenue on the continent comes from indirect taxes, or taxes that are actually very difficult to dodge. VAT, for instance, contributes roughly 30%. Pay as you earn, which is deducted through the withholding tax regime, contributes like 16 or 17%. So indirect taxes, when you look at them, or taxes from withholding taxes, taxes from indirect taxes, contribute the most of the revenue on the continent. And therefore that tells you that compliance on the African continent is rightly labeled as managed compliance and not really willingness or voluntary compliance. There is a friend of mine who used to say voluntary compliance doesn't exist. And I think even in the developed world, it's because of intelligence systems that force people at times to comply. So the managed compliance, in my view, first of all, is driven by about three factors. One is the facilitation part of it, making it very easy to comply. And African tax administrations have actually done this. There is a lot of automation that is going on there, simplification, taxpayer education, all this is doing very well. The other pillar is the enforcement, which I will again briefly talk about it. Enforcement pressures, how costly is it if you don't comply? And then the other one, which is the key to my intervention here, is trust. Trust in government spending practices, and trust in the tax administration itself. And my argument is that trust is the weakest and most binding constraint to voluntary or willingness to contributing tax. So when I come to facilitation, like I said, tax administrations have done so well. Automation has taken over. But this facilitation only reduces friction. It cannot, on its own, lead to willingness. Enforcement, it is another issue. It is still limited, it is necessary, but if it is selective, it is causing also a lot of friction. We have been doing a study as African Tax Administration Forum on taxation of the rich. And when you look at the statistics on the compliance of the powerful, the compliance of politicians, it is demotivating. And if that is a fact, then talking about voluntary or willingness when taxpayers are seeing that the powerful, the rich, the politicians are not contributing their share, then that is a problem. Coming to the trust issue, which in my view, and this is a very great conference to discuss that weakest link on the continent, trust is the core constraint in my view. I want to look at, I looked at the statistics from the Afrobarometer survey, which covered about 34 African countries, and the statistics are quite interesting. 52% of the citizens in the 34% say they do not trust their government. That is a very high statistic. And 54 believe that corruption in their governments had increased in that reference period. On the fairness bit, 56 believe rich people pay bribes to avoid taxes. These are not out of statistics. They are statistics published on the African Barometer survey if you access the data. And then 57 believe ordinary citizens are unlikely to bribe to avoid taxes. So it is clearly telling you that the perceptions severely undermine tax morale. What we really need to understand is tax or trust is experimental. It is built through what citizens see, what citizens hear, and what citizens experience. So what do citizens see in public investment matters, for instance? If we go and everywhere we see most of the public infrastructure like roads funded by World Bank, hospital funded by so-and-so, this one funded by this development partner, the citizens are not able to connect where their money is going, even if the money is being used to pay salaries of the public servants. But if what we see is funded by a development partner out there, is funded by so-and-so, we are not able to connect, so where did my money actually go? Then, in terms of what do citizens hear, if we hear on televisions, on radio, that so-and-so has stolen this much, this money has gone into this thing, etc. So if what we hear is all negative, it is corruption scandals and that kind of thing, and the statistic from Afrobarometer says it all, then that also will affect the willingness part of compliance. And what you need to know is, when you look at good and bad news spreads so easily. When you talk about corruption, it will spread so easily and everyone is watching it. And good news that even when government is actually doing a lot, that is not marketed. And therefore, governments represented here, they need to be deliberate on marketing the good news to counter the bad news out there, which spreads so fast like wildfire. And also, third and most importantly, is what citizens actually experience when they, for instance, seek government service. If we go to the hospitals and there is no medicine, if I pay taxes and I have to pay again a private school to teach my kid, if I have to pay taxes and I have to pay for medical, then all that brings tax morale in problems. And therefore, trust is the major issue. If we want to improve confidence, we need to address what citizens see, what citizens hear, and what citizens improve. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think this deserves a round of applause indeed. The most important word out of very many words that we've heard here today is trust. So I think you identified the single most important component in this discussion, in my opinion. Next, I would like to turn to Mr. Gregoire Rota-Graziosi, the professor of economics at the university with a difficult name, and I will have you introduce that properly, as well as being a research fellow at Ferdi. Gregoire, the fiscal transitions, the transformation of a country's tax structure away from customs duties towards greater resilience on the domestic revenues, they have been at the heart of this discussion for development strategies for decades. But as we have been discussing, the outcomes have remain debated when it comes to efficiency and long-term sustainability. So my question to you is, has the fiscal transition in the developing countries really worked? And more precisely, can VAT sustainably replace trade taxes without harming the equity and broader development outcomes, which of course is the underlying mission to strengthen? So over to you. I understand you have some slides to present.
Yeah, thank you.
But before you begin, I completely forgot to mention that there is simultaneous translation, English to French, and you have headphones in your pockets in your seats. My apologies, I should have said this in the beginning. Over to you.
Thank you very much for this question. Thank you for the invitation to Professor Kunal and Savoya. So this is based on this question. I tried to provide some replies, but are based on some previous working papers done at the University of Clermont-Auvergne and Cergy-Ferdy. So over the past, since the 2000, we had what we called the trade liberalization, even if today and with the second Trump administration, we have a comeback of the tariffs, and we can discuss this later. But this tax transition mean for a lot of countries in the world a significant decrease in the tariff rates, which were very important in terms of revenue mobilization, especially for developing countries. And in order to compensate for these revenue losses, a lot of countries adopted VAT across the world. This VAT was a source of revenue, of domestic revenue, because it's based on domestic consumption, and I will go back on this issue or this definition later. And it was also a way to modernize national tax regime and also tax administration. So here you have graphs of the decrease of the weighted mean tariffs in the world. You see, we decreased from around 10% in the 80s to around 3% on average in 2025. But it may rise again. So I will be quick on INAMPREX results. Whatever we use here, an index of liberalization, which encompasses several dimensions, not only the decrease in tariff rate, but also some measures in terms of openness and non-trade barriers and so on, which are named the Sachs-Warner Index, which has been generalized by other economic authors. So the impact is clearly negative. That means that trade liberalization decreased tax revenue unambiguously. We had other results in the literature where trade liberalization increased tax revenue, but mainly for developed or for richer countries. On average, we cover all the countries in the world with the UN-WIDER database, and we observe a negative impact. If we go in the details, we observe, of course, it seems obvious, but we observe a very significant negative impact on direct tax, because through trade liberalization, you have an increase in tax competition, and you have all these tax incentives regime to attract foreign direct investment, which may erode also tax revenue and so on. And we have, by contrast, an increase, trade liberalization, increase indirect tax. Why? Due to the adoption of VAT. Here you have a map of the VAT adoption in the world. And VAT, so it's the last, almost the last tables. So VAT, when I cross with indicators of index of liberalization, you observe that the number 0.6 is positive, and we have these stars, which means that it is significant. So VIT was a convenient way to compensate for revenue losses due to the tax transition, due to the decrease in tariff rates. So VIT, countries which adopted VIT before their liberalization or just after, managed to save some revenue or to improve their revenue. Now I'm going more in the details for resource-rich countries, and especially we can discuss later about critical minerals. VIT has been based on what we call the destination principle, which was a temporary solution for the EU when the EU Commission built a unique market. What does it mean? It means that due to these destination principles, the taxing rights of VIT on an international transaction is due to the country where the final consumers are located. Here we have an impulse, so a graphics of the adoption of VIT at date 0 and the evolution of tax revenue after the adoption. And we see that in non-resource dependent countries, we have an increase of revenue. That means that in OECD countries in general, I mean, VIT adoption improve revenue. While it's not the case for resource-rich countries. Why? Because a large part of their economy is based, of course, on on natural resources. And this sector is exporter, and so it doesn't generate any VIT. And beyond revenue, VIT adoption didn't trigger this industrialization process that we expected, because VIT had a lot of promises. It was a French invention in the 50s, and it was a more neutral tax system than a turnover tax or a sales tax with a cascading effect. So just I will finish on this. Look at the first economy which has a VIT in the world. It's not the US. The United States don't have any VIT. It's China. And China didn't respect strictly the destination principle. It has been mainly studied by traded economists, not by tax economists or tax policy guys. China refund partially only VIT on their, for their exporters, and especially for their exporters of raw materials. Two objectives, of course, securing some tax revenue by non-refunding, you keep your money in your treasury. And also, it was only one element, not the element, but one element also of the strategy of China to increase the added value of their exportation. And go, for instance, I explained the case of copper supply chain. And since we have the ambassadors of Chile, imagine that you have copper produced, extracted in Chile. The Chinese, I don't know, Australian or Canadian mining firms operating in Chile import equipment, materials, or buy locally. When they export this copper to China, they receive a full refund of VIT. By definition of VIT and by application, strict application by Chile of the destination principle. Then this copper arrives in China, is refined, processed, but if the processor wants to export this copper concentrates or copper anodes, it doesn't receive any VIT refund. Why? Because China don't want to provide an incentive to increase the added value. That means that the Chinese processor of copper has an incentive to sell domestically this concentrate to electrical vehicles producer and so on. And these firms will receive a full refund of VIT credit. So at the end, for instance, on copper concentrate, you don't have any VIT collected in China. In Chile, but you have some VIT collected in China or in Europe or in US, I mean in the final consumers' countries. And so I don't want to raise a new or another debate in addition to the allocation of taxing right on income tax between the source and the residence principle, but also in indirect tax, and especially on VAT, we have two principles: the destination, which is almost by all the countries in the world except China implemented strictly, and we have also the origin principle. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for these insightful remarks and for not raising a new issue, because that is very appreciated. Turning now to my good colleague Ben Dickinson, the Deputy Director of the Centre for Tax Policy and Administration here at the OECD. Ben, in its latest report on building tax capacity, the Platform for Collaboration on Tax, which is a joint initiative of the OECD, IMF, UN, and the World Bank Group, highlighted the need to improve analytical tax policy capacity and the importance of data to underpin such analysis. And we know that the Sevilla Commitment further stressed the importance of revenue data and statistics and the need for the investment in related capacities. So in that context, how can national authorities and international partners better invest in building capacity in taxation, including in data such as administrative records and revenue statistics, in ways that genuinely support the reforms and the coordination and the long-term capacity in line with the Sevilla Platform for Action, and as well as in line with the remarks that we've heard here today. Over to you. And this all in 6-7 minutes.
Not much to do. Is that working?
No.
Thank you. And thanks for inviting me, Raga. You noted earlier that my bit of the OECD house is comprised of nerds and people with...
You said nerds, I think.
Those concerned with rates and codes. But I think we would like to associate ourselves with the importance of understanding tax morale and voluntary compliance in particular, and to better understanding some important political economy issues that we've heard about, which I'll come back to at the end of my remarks if there's time. But I think to answer your question about tax policy, I think just to report what ministers of finance say to us. We work with about 170 countries across the world on international taxation, but what ministers of finance, particularly in low and middle income countries, tell us is that they're making tax policy blind. And that is partly because they struggle to devote the necessary resources in tax policy units and the capability of tax policy making overall. I think there's then therefore a strong case for donors to more systematically support the tax policy capability function in general, and they should do that with confidence, because although ODA is obviously declining, the track record of ODA on several areas of tax policy and administration is very strong. It's fragmented, but there's good evidence, and some of that is mentioned in the report that you mentioned, Raga. So donors should still be emboldened to more systematically support that function. So what might governments do? Well, fundamentally, they've got to invest in data and statistics. Without data and statistics, tax policy just isn't possible. And we're very proud of our statistics, revenue statistics at the OECD, and our partnership in Africa, not least with ATAF and with Lucky Star at the Africa Union Commission, who we'll hear from in a second. And also with the Development Centre, of course. And I think we believe that we've got a gold standard of statistics here, because they are fully transparent. They're fully comparable internationally, and that's an important political economy point, which I'll come back to at the end. They're totally comprehensive, 63 consistent categories of revenue collection documented through statistics. And because of the process by which they are gathered, they're also locally owned. So I think, I don't know whether we have doubled the number of countries that undertake revenue statistics, but it's close to that. We're 139 countries doing statistics in exactly the same way across the world. 38 in Africa, 33 in Asia, and 23 in Latin America. And there's some evidence that the way in which these statistics are produced and analysed are driving different reforms. Personal income tax reform in Cameroon, revenue targets in Eswatini, and the performance of health and tobacco taxes in the Philippines, to name 3. So I think, finally, just a word about how the international environment might shape domestic policy choices, which is an important political economy point. We've been preoccupied at the OECD with international tax evasion and avoidance, and we're making progress. And I think the base erosion and profit shifting project has been vital, because if the largest and most prominent taxpayers are seen to be avoiding tax, what message does that send to other taxpayers, and with a clear impact on tax morale? On the other hand, our report that we've done with the IMF and the other international organisations suggests that it's very important to keep an eye on what you might call the less glamorous aspects of tax policy and administration, and the hard grind of capacity building, particularly on tax collection, which there is strong evidence that delivers results. One of the very interesting thing about the tax world, all the nerds, is that they form a very, very strong grouping of peers. And one of the things that we've noticed is that, and I was struggling with a term for this. It's not shared sovereignty, because that's associated with academics from another era, but maybe it's something like borrowed accountability. What we've seen in international tax reform is tax officials drawing on international comparative experience to drive domestic reform. So where there's no domestic appetite for change, often they reach out to the international experience and some of the peer review groups that take place at the OECD, which can be an external driver of change and reform. So we've seen that very much on our international tax norm-setting work, but we also see it on statistics. And I can remember vividly hearing the Minister of Finance of Cameroon saying, comparing his own tax to GDP ratio with his neighbours and saying, come on, we've got to do better here, and using that international comparative experience to drive domestic reform. So let me leave it there, Raga, and delighted to come back for questions.
Thank you very much, Ben. And just for the record, I never used the word nerd, but I can secretly, if you promise not to tell anyone, I have a fondness for nerds, so we're all good now. Last, but certainly not least, Lucky Star Miandesi was mentioned by Ben. She is the Tax and Domestic Resource Mobilization Advisor at the Department of Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry and Minerals of the African Union Commission, a long-standing partner of the Development Centre, and we are so happy to have you online with us here today in what must be a very busy period at the African Union Commission with the summit coming up this weekend, so very greatly appreciate it. The regional institutions play a powerful role in shaping the reform agendas by fostering exactly what we're doing now with you, fostering peer learning and collective ambition, as Ben was mentioning, among countries. From the AU's perspective, what role can the regional institutions play in strengthening the domestic revenue mobilization across your member states, especially in supporting coordination and learning, and by, of course, providing the political momentum for reforms. Over to you, Lucky Star.
Good afternoon. And thank you so much, Raga, for your excellent moderation. And thank you to colleagues I've seen, all protocols observed. It is a much welcomed opportunity to be able to present today. So I will try to keep the time. So from the AU's perspective, and this has been mentioned a bit, the importance of resource mobilization for us as a continent cannot be overstated. The fact that the world is changing, we're having to do a lot better when it comes to raising our own DRM to finance our own public goods and services, social protection for our citizens, without over-reliance on things like aid and the debt situation, with more African countries, for example, being under debt distress. We also have the issues that were mentioned by Kunal at the beginning on taxpayers now understanding better taxation, the tax morale, the idea of how we're designing tax policies. We've seen what the implications of certain taxes are in countries like, for example, Kenya. So taxpayers are becoming more aware. So the idea of fair taxation is also becoming more prominent. And for us at the African Union, it's also the idea that DRM is a core pillar of our Agenda 2063. It's central to the SDGs. SDG 17 has been mentioned, SDG 16.4 on illicit financial flows. We saw it also being very prominent in Seville. So it's no longer optional, but a foundation to our fiscal sovereignty in Africa and development financing. So very quickly, again, I will, this is something I take a lot of pride in, the fact that we developed this annual report with the OECD ATF, with support also, technical support also from banks like the AFDB and others, the Revenue Statistics in Africa report. And I think this complements the report from UNU-WIDER, and Kunal mentioned that there has been progress when it comes to the rising tax to GDP ratio in Africa. For us was the 38 African countries that we looked at revenues from 1990 to 2023, and they rose by 0.5 percentage points level from previous years in Africa. And this is, of course, good news, but it's still very low in comparison to other regions. And you can see, for the continent, there's also a variation. We vary from like 34% in Tunisia to as low as 2.9%. And I like the presentation that was done by the representative from Sierra Leone, which very much articulated the situation for some of the countries in Africa that might not have the tax base as big as other countries in Africa. So we are taking note of this, but the average is good and it is rising. This is just a regional representation, just to see also the performance from Africa. And I think sometimes I'm asked why we insist on the focus on tax to GDP ratio, without the risk of, again, also introducing another topic, is that this has direct implications, obviously, on our fiscal capacities in Africa. It does have implications on public service funding and economic growth. So this is why this is such a good measure for us to see how the projections are for the continent. So just to move on to the question of what regional institutions can do that states alone cannot do. And from the experience we have at the Africa Union, one has been the coordination aspect of things, the fact that we're able to coordinate and align the tax rules, the data that we are getting. We have the StrataFric, which is our statistical division of the Africa Union. They also work with us on the revenue statistics report. So we align some of this data, and we're able to see where there is issues of compliance gaps, where deal with issues of harmful tax incentives. There's also the policy convergence element of it all. How do policies in Africa converge? The latest has, of course, been on digital taxation, cross-border tax, investments and tax incentives. Peer learning, this has been mentioned also by colleagues who spoke before me, and the importance of even creating this platform, for example, today, to share perspective, to share experiences, and also to learn from them and to better each other's tax economy and how we can raise DRM very well together. the convening power of the African Union. I think this is a powerful element. Everyone who spoke has spoken about tax not only being a technical issue, but also being a political issue. This is a key pillar of influence when it comes to having a platform where policymakers can also come to debate and to interact and come up with policies that have the political buy-in, and that's hence the political momentum that we create, not only with ministers of finance, with revenue authorities, with FIUs, with other line ministries, even customs coming together and having an exchange. And this helps to better the policies that we eventually introduce on taxation. So very quickly, I will go through where tax, and I also mentioned illicit financial flows because this also ties to DRM, but I will, of course, focus on the tax element of this, but where it's anchored under the AU. So on the political side, as I've said, it's a core thing. It was since the beginning of the foundation of the Union, 1963, it was core, but more recently, it's under Agenda 2063 and some of the other policies and declarations that have been adopted therein. We also have the aspect of the institutional anchoring, and it's anchored within our division, which is ETIM, and also with the Division of Peace and Security that deals most with our common African position on asset recovery. And of course, therein you start thinking of issues of beneficial ownership. The AU Anti-Corruption Board that sits in Arusha also has aspects that they deal with on taxation. But more importantly, strategically, we have two frameworks that were adopted in 2022, the tax framework strategy for AU, and also the illicit financial flow strategy. And coordination-wide, we coordinate not only amongst ourselves at the AU, we coordinate through our regional economic bodies, as we call RECs, and also at national level with the member states. We have a platform which we call the STC, which is a specialized technical committee that brings in together experts at the national level who work on tax and IFFs. And also then it goes to the STC ministerial, which are the ministers of economy, finance, economy, integration, who come together to then adopt decision there. And then it goes to the heads of state. So moving forward, the difference here is between, to mention just a little bit about our tax strategy. Our tax strategy is a strategy that we developed for revenue building, of course, looking at the tax systems in Africa, how we can support the expansion of tax bases, while at the same time keeping in mind the idea of fair taxation and emphasis on also how we can harmonize reform and move forward together. And it works, it reinforces our IFF strategy, which is a protection mechanisms with the figures that we know on illicit financial flows that leaves Africa, but just closing those leakages and a lot of tax crime and tax abuse that you find therein. So that's the difference between both of them, but they reinforce one another, and we work towards both together and insist that member states use them as platforms to refer to when they're making laws at the national level, and also looking at ways of raising DRM at the national level. Then we have the idea of how we strengthen DRM at the African Union. I already mentioned a little bit of this when I was talking about the value of having a regional body or coming to a regional body. Of course, the strengthening of the coordination aspect of it. We also have the peer learning and knowledge exchange. In this, we've developed what we call an anti-illicit financial flows policy tracker, which is a tool that we are using. We developed it in collaboration with ATEF and Tax Justice Network Africa, and we're piloting it in different African countries to look at how, well, IFFs is increasing and it's still taking away money that would have gone to domestic resource mobilization. So looking at data, institutional issues, the legal issues that countries are still facing. We are also continuing to build the political momentum in Africa around this issue of DRM and how it impacts other issues such as healthcare, such as taxation. So for example, our STC ministerial last year was around taxes and DRM, but also how it impacts the healthcare. So there was side events that we had on health taxation. And also how we bring countries together to leverage the AU representation or the African representation as a regional voice body at global levels. Of course, increasingly representation at the G20, at the UN, and at the OECD when it comes to the IF and other global forum and other platforms.
And so, finally?
Yes. So what this means for African countries, it means that we reform faster together and not alone. It means that we learn from our peers. It means that we make it more political also, not just technical, of course, dealing with the technical, but bringing in the political aspect. It means that we can defend our taxing rights as one, not only as a regional level, but also at the global level. And then we can convert data into diagnostics, diagnostics into reform, and to reform into commitment. So I think this will be my last point, so that I conclude there on the importance of DRM and the perspective that we have from the African Union. Thank you so much, Raga. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Lucky Star. This was excellent overview of the important work that you're doing at the African Union. And again, I want to wish you good luck with the summit. I am going to use my powers as the moderator here to steal 5 minutes, not from the ambassadors panel, but I'm going to give from my closing remarks at least 5 minutes, so we can open the floor for any burning questions that we might have. And then I will combine that with your final thoughts. So if we have a couple of questions, Julia is there with a microphone, so if you could please raise your hands. This offer is not going anywhere. Ambassador Brooke.
Thank you so much, Raga, and thanks very much indeed to our panelists. So my name is David Brooke. I'm the Irish ambassador here to the OECD. I'm also have the privilege of being the chair of the Development Centre's governing board, and I will speak very briefly at the end as well. But just listen, I just had a question, I don't know, for probably for all of you and for Lucky Star as well, but any of you can choose to maybe leap in and answer it. But listening to you, I mean, this idea of trust seems very much to be central to everything I think we've been talking about this morning. But when you look at it, there's sort of different pillars. Listening to you, when we think about trust or we think about tax morale, there's how taxes are designed, whether they're progressive or not. There's the enforcement of existing rules. And then there's also the questions around effectiveness in public spending. So you sort of, for me at least, that's how I would, listening to all of you, those three sort of pillars seem to be the most significant or most important. But maybe just turn it back to you. Which of those probably are the most critical, do you think, of those three elements? Which is the really, really important one that we need to get right? Or is it all of them? Thank you.
Thank you, David. A question here, and please introduce yourself.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Rachel. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Oxford. So my question is sort of to everybody, it's an overarching one. I think this is about tax and development, this idea that tax can drive development by investing in the right sectors, social sectors, etc. I think one of the challenges for sub-Saharan African and South Asian countries is the fact that the people who need development the most are not normally the taxpayers, or at least not the major ones. They're paying indirect taxes. And Professor Sen's research showed that what we tax drives what public services are provided, because the people who pay the tax have the capacity to demand the services that they need and want. So I guess the overarching question then is there a way to think about tax to ensure that the people who need, that tax money still builds schools in rural areas or health centers in rural areas where tax is not necessarily collected?
Very good questions, and I don't see any other hands raised. So what I will ask now of the panel, in the same order as we started, to reflect on these questions that were posed to all of you, and then you get, in 1 or 2 minutes, you get to do all of this and give your final comments. So no pressure, but we will start with you, Philip.
Thank you very much. I was trying to understand the questions, but let me start with the last one. If I understand it right, it's like, is there any way to think about tax to benefit the rural people? Is that right? Okay. The rural people do not pay, Right. So that's fine. So this is about the distribution principle. So you are looking at trying to tax the wealthy who have more, and then redistribute that to those in the rural areas who actually do not have more. And how you do that distribution, that's where government comes in now. And that's where a government that is actually credible comes in. A government that is fearless, that will not say, okay, I've collected most of the taxes. Let me say, if the taxes are collected mostly from the urban areas, where the wealthy people actually live, government will say, okay, let me also spend let me spend the tax collections that got from the urban areas on the urban people, because this is where I think I'll be questioned if I actually do not invest that tax. But a government who thinks about ending poverty will say, okay, this is about redistribution. I've collected from the rich, doesn't mean I have to actually give you again. I have to now invest in the poor where they actually need it. So here I'll talk about the principle of redistribution. The other question I was trying to also understand is about trust. It's about progressivity of the tax, and then which pillar is actually a better one. I spoke about progressivity, which is very important because, again, it's related because with progressivity, I'm talking about taxing those that have the capacity to pay, particularly those that have more, and that's very important. Even the context of stronger taxation, wherein we want to engage those who have more power and those who also have more resources. So if you tax them more, meaning that you're bringing issues of progressivity, and those who do not have much, actually they have to also pay their own portion, because at least for the governance dividend, they also have the power. You know, there's always an adage that says, put your mouth where your money is. So even though that may be minimal, but at least contribute some amount to the tax net. So at least you have the leverage to hold government accountable. But of course, in the context of progressivity, you tax more those that earn more, and they redistribute that, if that is what I understand. Or maybe Ronald will also get in there.
Thank you very much. And Ronald, sorry.
Thank you so much again. I think coming to the question from my brother there, I think all are important. And what I see, a lot of effort has been put to address issues to do with progressivity and those technical aspects. The likes of WIDER, UNU-WIDER, IMF, World Bank, they have put a lot of effort to address some of these regressivity issues in the tax system. I think the major gap has been on the weak link I talked about, the trust in government spending practices. I think the efforts here are a bit limited. And I think what we need to really look at is when we talk about DRM or boosting revenue mobilization, it should be taken as a whole of government approach. Who is responsible for what? When it comes to trust, this is largely an issue of government. But the question of where is our taxes going is actually asked to the tax administration. So we need to see how does government actually, the role of government actually come into play. What is the role of government in building morale? Even if the question is asked to the tax administration, the right respondent should actually be government, but this government is not always with the taxpayer. So the government should actually support the tax administration to show visibility of what actually it is doing, so that the revenue authority is now able to answer when taxpayers actually ask them, where is our money actually going? So I think that's what I can say. This is a whole of government approach. We need to know who is responsible for building trust. On the side of the tax administration, I think as far as trust is concerned, they are responsible to build trust by fighting corruption among the tax officials. For government, it's about service delivery, and it should also have programs to educate the public on what actually physical goods and services are actually delivering. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Moving now to Gregoire.
Okay, thank you. Okay, regarding trust, as an economist, I don't believe in this notion. I don't have the elementary package in my education to understand what it means trust. What I believe in tax is third party, which reveal the information to the tax administration, but who is not the taxpayer, the employer who pays the PIT due or the payroll tax due to the employee. And since you are the ambassador of Ireland, all the GAFAM with their algorithm provide a lot of information, may provide it depends on the national tax laws. France modified recently its laws in order to implement the solidarity of Amazon to provide the information of sellers on the marketplace. So this algorithm may be a very relevant third party for a lot of tax payment due in, I'm not speaking about CIT, just other tax due by operators in Africa and in developing countries. Regarding the taxing the poorest in the, or receiving the relation between the tax, the social contract, or the issue regarding the poorest in rural areas who don't pay tax and may not receive anything. Today, you have more than 80% of 95 countries in the world, given the last World Bank database, which provide subsidies of fuels, for instance. And these guys benefits from and these fuel subsidies represent a huge amount of budget in terms of GDP and so on. So they receive some form of assistance, but it's true that it is not well designed. It's a pure assistance to the poorest. The EU approach of collect more, spend better, which suggests to taxing more and to provide maybe more cash transfer program to alleviate poverty. But yeah, I'm seeing. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Ben.
Yeah, thank you, Raga. I guess it's kind of intuitive that if you receive better public services, you'll be more willing to pay tax. Fine, but what does it mean? So I think you've got to focus on what the practical actions are, and there's all sorts of different things going on throughout the world in OECD countries and in all other countries that might help. So there's a lot of effort going into the ease of paying taxes, because this is actually a determinant of tax morale. That's critically important, how easy it is to actually pay tax. There's a lot of investment going on in integrity systems, particularly the use of AI, and many African countries, for example, are leapfrogging the technology experience of the OECD countries, and AI holds great promise there. Earmarking, hypothecation of taxes, so you can justify how a particular tax has gone to a particular service. This is unpopular amongst economists, but very popular amongst politicians for obvious reasons. And the whole transparency agenda. So I think you've got to focus on what the practicalities are, what the experience is, and there's masses of it out there. And regional organisations, international organisations, and forums like this are good places to share all of that experience. On the problem of poor people in rural areas needing to benefit but not paying taxes, I think that the conventional wisdom is broad-based taxes, low rates, and I think, again, there's a lot of interesting experience. There's lots of governments that are experimenting with presumptive taxes, low rate, easy to determine taxes, with the idea that if everybody pays a bit, you reinforce the fiscal contract eventually. But very hard to collect, very expensive to collect, and it's a long-term argument. So I think the jury's out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And again, last but not least, your final reflections, Lucky Star, very short.
Thank you so much. On the answers to the ambassador from Ireland, I think I will go with the answers given by my colleagues from ATAF and also from Sierra Leone, but also just emphasizing that I do think trust is a fundamental issue, and I think I will use that to answer Rachel, who's actually studying in my alma mater, where I studied taxation. So hopefully my answer will resonate. So I think about tax when it comes to three elements. Collection, allocation, and spending. And then, so my answer to you is that I think about it like this. So what we need, especially in developing countries, is proper tax policy design, tailor-made to our national context, that takes into mind a political philosophy of social contract. Because then that also brings in, so in all elements, in tax policy, in tax collection, we need a social contract there for citizens to understand that, the taxpayer rather, when it comes to the allocation, how taxes are being allocated, and also when it comes to tax spending. I think I will leave it there, Raga. Over to you.
Thank you very much. That was a great conclusion, or to pull it all together. And I have to admit, I will have to give 7 minutes of my closing remarks, but this was definitely worth having the exchange here. So please join me in thanking this excellent panel for their valuable contribution. And I would like to make the transfer now to the ambassadors panel. If I can have you step down and take your seats, please, and get the ambassadors up here. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Corina Mori-Burnett, the ambassador of Benin to France, His Excellency Mr. Baye Mokhtar Diop, ambassador of Senegal to France, His Excellency Mr. Hernan Andreas Frigolet Cordova. He is the ambassador of Chile to the OECD, and His Excellency Mr. Luis Fernando Medina, who is the ambassador of Colombia to the OECD. So please join us here on stage. And we have a similar framing here as we did in the first session, except I'm not going to be sitting, so you can take a seat. Except I will ask the ambassadors the same question. One question for everyone. And this, just to introduce the sort of the thinking behind the panel, of course, seeing the perspectives of the countries. Now we have been talking about the instruments, the tools, and the tasks ahead, but we need to hear from the ambassadors how to understand how the technical reforms intersect with political leadership, with public trust and institutional capacity, all the things that we have been discussing here. So my question to you is the following. Can you highlight the main drivers of success or lack thereof in implementing tax reforms and enhancing domestic resource mobilization in your countries? And, of course, what lessons can you share that could be useful for other countries? Here we are, always in the spirit of mutual learning, so I would very much like to hear from you on these issues. And I think I will go Africa first, start with the ambassador of Benin, move then to LAC.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. So my name is Corina Mori-Burnett. I'm the ambassador of Benin here in Paris. Maybe to start, before digging into details, saying that at the end of the day, and I think we all agree on that, domestic revenue mobilization is not only about collecting revenue. And I think, on my perspective, it's really an architecture of trust. And that's the turning point of how we do it. And what about trust? Trust is not decreed, trust is built on time. And maybe that's why the figure that we've been seeing at the beginning of the presentation don't grow that fast, because we're working on building trust. And this reality is universal, and we can see that it's the challenge for developing economies, it's a challenge for emerging economies, and it's also the challenge for African economy and West African economy, because we are quite in the middle from the tax to GDP rate. And what we point out but not really said is that there is a difference between of course, the emerging economies and developing economies, is that we have a narrow tax base and most of our people are not formalized. And that's why it makes it a little bit more challenging to collect. And also that we rely on a few economic actors to collect these taxes. And for this reality, there is behind a very simple trust, is that because the subject was how to fund the Sustainable Development Goals, and you cannot fund it in continuously increasing the mandatory levies and the mandatory taxes. You need really to be in the not only technical and efficiency exercise, but to build that contract. And this contract will be a tax contract, but it'll also be a social contract. And your people and your citizens will accept to pay tax only if they can see the result of that taxes. We've been talking about infrastructure, we've been talking about education, we can talk also about health, and we can talk about job creation as well. And without the clear link between the taxation and the public services, the sustainable development goal fundings will remain fragile, and also the economic transformation that we're into will remain fragile as well. And I think this is exactly here where the example of what we've been doing in Benin could be useful. We've been working on the, let's say, the governance transformation back in 2016 about. And what we've been working on is having a clear framework and a clear strategy. And by transforming the tax collection, it's not only about working on VAT, working on custom, working on VAT, customs, and other form of taxes, is how you can raise awareness, how you can acknowledge your people, how the taxes are used, how you can work on a better digitalization of your different products, make it easier. And you were referring about leapfrogging the tax collection and leapfrogging the way you are informing your citizen how the basis taxes are used is key. And it's very important also to say, and it's been pointed out by other speakers, is that you need to be balanced. Because of course you have to increase your taxes base, but you also have to attract foreign investment. You have to also attract investment to build your industrial capacity. So you have to make sure that on the side you don't push an excessive tax pressure on investor, entrepreneurs, and on the other side that you're acknowledging your people of why they are paying taxes. And I will come back to the question of the student of Oxford University. You were saying that you can make sure that the poorest citizen will benefit from the taxes they are not paying. They are paying taxes. They are paying VAT because they are consuming goods and they are also consuming some kind of services. So they will benefit from the tax they pay, maybe a higher amount than the other one, but they are taxpayers, and you have to make sure that they understand how they participate into the tax basis of the country. And all the work that we've been doing into digitalization, awareness, governance, make us gain 5 points in tax GDP ratio from 2012 to 2014. So we've been moving from 9.2 to 13.2, excuse me. So almost 5 points. So we are not reaching the 50%, but we are gaining ground, and we will continue to work toward that. But as I say, digitalization is key, and 95% of this tax collecting are collecting through digital. And then what is very key to build trust is to have a plan. It's a long-term perspective, and we've been aligned all the taxes plan under the global government action plans. Now we are launch the 2016 vision through Alafia. I will be very fast for the end. But I mean, just to conclude, so I will conclude. So only collecting tax is not sufficient. You have to raise awareness, but then it's not all about taxes. It's all about how you reallocate the dorming and sleeping stock to a productive economy. And you also need to have locally agents that will do that. And from the Benin's perspective, it will be the Caisse des Dépôts Bénin. the Caisse des Dépôts Bénin will be responsible for investing the stock capital into productive projects, into industrialization, into job creation. And so you need to have this balance between not pushing too much pressure on the investment and productive investment. You need to raise awareness, but you need also to make sure that you allocate the capital to projects that your people can see, and making sure that you're creating jobs and making sure that you are aligned in a long-term strategy and not only in a short term, to not creating too much frustration like you can see in developing countries regarding the tax allocation and the tax collection. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as always, you have a wonderful way of saying a lot in a very constructive way and leave us with a lot of thoughts. Thank you very much. Moving now to Chile, Ambassador, what is your takeaway and answer to this simple question?
Thank you, Raga. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and trying to share what is, in my opinion, what characterizes the Chilean tax reforms in the last 30 years. Mm-hmm. First, general appreciation is that the midterm evaluation of development financing policies underscores a fundamental lesson of modern public economics, and also an economist. So sustained growth cannot be decoupled from strong institutions, credible fiscal frameworks, and effective public revenue systems. So we're talking about an ecosystem at rest to get proper tax systems put in place. In an environment characterized by inflationary pressures and heightened financial volatility, the quality of fiscal governance matters at least as much as the level of resources mobilized. At the core of the recent reforms in Chile lies a recognition that fiscal policy must be anchored in transparency, accountability, and medium-term consistency. The strengthening of institutional oversight, notably through the enhanced role that has been given to the Autonomous Fiscal Council. It has improved the quality of fiscal decision-making and also the evaluation of tax policies by introducing an informed and independent assessment of tax and budgetary policies. This institutional architecture has facilitated a more balanced dialogue between the executive and the legislature. It's quite important to get a huge debate between the executive and the legislature to give legitimacy to tax reforms. At the same time, the alignment with the BEPS agenda reflects an understanding that effective domestic resource mobilization depends not only on statutory tax rates, but on the integrity of the tax system and the capacity to ensure compliance by economic actors. If we have to search a second pillar of reform that has been applied in Chile, it has been the adoption of a fiscal sustainability framework grounded in the concept of a cyclically adjusted fiscal balance. This approach reflects a broader shift away from short-termism in fiscal policy by explicitly distinguishing between cyclical and structural components of revenue. Policymakers are better equipped to avoid pro-cyclical responses that amplify economic fluctuations. Adjustments for deviation in output relative to potential growth, as well as for volatility in commodity prices, for instance, copper, and nowadays also lithium, allow fiscal policy to respond to long-term fundamentals rather than transitory shocks, such as fragment strengthens credibility and enhances the stabilizing role of fiscal policy. Third, the introduction of an explicit public debt ceiling represents an important institutional commitment. It has recently been adopted by the current government. But by clearly articulating the constraints within which fiscal policy operates, it contributes to anchoring expectation and reinforcing confidence in the sustainability of public finances. But it's also important that debt ceilings are most effective when embedded within a current fiscal strategy that balances discipline with the flexibility needed to respond to economic downturns. The administration's fiscal rule, centered on a structural balance target, provides this strategic anchor. It serves not merely as a technical benchmark, but as a guiding principle for annual budgeting decisions. Now moving to the tax administration's compliance and equity. Efforts to enhance tax administration efficiency reflect a growing awareness that revenue performance depends as much on administrative capacity as on policy design. Improvements in public financial management, including the active management of treasury balances under a zero daily balance framework, have contributed to a more efficient use of public resources, particularly in the presence of uneven budget execution patterns. Equally significant has been the expansion of compliance gap analysis beyond indirect taxation to encompass also corporate and personal income taxes. While VAT compliance has long been monitored in the case of Chile, recent assessments of income tax compliance provide a more comprehensive understanding of revenue leakages. This analysis reveals not only the potential fiscal gains from reducing evasion, but also the broader economic implications of informality, which undermines both efficiency and fairness in the tax system. Digitalization is also a relevant pillar for tax administration credibility by taxpayers who can perceive how their business activity is being monitored in near real time. In the case of Chile, we are sending them messages about what is going on because they are not given the bills in the last 2 or 3 hours. But at the same time, the tax compliance burden for individual and corporate taxpayers has been reduced so far. So always this balancing of what we are calling to pay, and the other side make it easy for everybody to pay all the taxes they have to face for. Individuals and small and medium enterprises receive their tax return forms pre-filled by tax administration, enhancing the efficiency and the accuracy of tax compliance. In this context,
finally.
Yes, I'm going to finish. Greater transparency in the evaluation of tax expenditure is essential. See, quantifying the fiscal cost of exemptions and preferential regimes allows policymakers to assess whether such measures deliver their intended economic benefit or whether equivalent resources would be more effectively deployed through direct and accountable public spending. This perspective is central to ensuring that tax systems support inclusive growth rather than reinforcing distortions. I will end there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's very interesting to hear about the experience of Chile and all the work that you have been mentioning here. And I want to now move back to Africa, to the beautiful country of Senegal. Ambassador Diop, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Raga. Je voudrais, à la suite de mes collègues, partager quelques réflexions en lien avec la politique fiscale du Sénégal. Ma tâche sera davantage facilitée par le fait qu'en septembre 2025, 5 lois ont été respectivement adoptées à l'Assemblée nationale. 5 lois successivement. Une nouvelle loi instituant un code des investissements, un nouveau code des impôts, un nouveau code des douanes, complété par une loi sur la déclaration de patrimoine. Il y avait déjà une première loi, mais la nouvelle a élargi le nombre de personnes d'autorités assujetties à la déclaration de patrimoine, non plus seulement aux autorités politiques, ministres, présidents, etc., mais aux directeurs d'agence, toutes les autorités qui ont en charge la gestion de domaines stratégiques de l'économie. Et enfin, une loi sur l'accès à l'information. Toutes ces lois ont été vendues par le gouvernement au Parlement pour renforcer la bonne gouvernance, renforcer la transparence et contribuer à lutter davantage contre la corruption. En rappelant ces lois, je veux insister ici pour vraiment appuyer toutes les déclarations, toutes les bonnes idées qui ont été émises avant, que le premier principe qui gouverne la politique fiscale d'une nation, c'est la transparence et la bonne gouvernance. Il faut que les citoyens soient convaincus que l'impôt, la taxe, les redevances sont prélevées dans un souci de renforcer la bonne gouvernance. C'est le premier principe. Le deuxième, la confiance au gouvernement. Et ça découle en fait de la lutte contre la corruption. Quand le citoyen voit que l'État fait des efforts pour renforcer la bonne gouvernance, la transparence, naturellement, la confiance vient tout seul. Et la confiance vaut plus que les notes qui sont données aux États par les agents de notation. Je vous donne un exemple bien simple. Cela fait bientôt 2 ans que le Sénégal peine à conclure un accord de financement avec le FMI, par exemple. Et pourtant, nous parvenons à financer notre budget. Nous parvenons à lever des fonds sur le marché financier régional. Pourtant, ceux qui mettent leur argent au bénéfice du Sénégal, ce sont des entreprises, ce sont des particuliers, ce sont des banques. Et ils savent tous que la note souveraine du Sénégal a été baissée à 2 ou 3 reprises. Ça veut dire que la confiance, c'est le fondement de toute action publique. C'était le deuxième principe. Le troisième, c'est l'équité et la justice fiscale. Beaucoup l'ont évoqué ici, l'équité et la justice fiscale conditionnent en Afrique particulièrement le souci de formaliser le secteur informel. Parce que 80% de l'activité économique échappe au circuit officiel. Et donc, sont difficilement taxables. Donc, il y a des efforts à faire pour formaliser l'économie et ainsi permettre à l'État d'augmenter ses revenus en termes de taxes. Et ça, c'est soutenu par le principe de l'équité et de la justice fiscale. Nos États, très souvent, obtiennent leurs ressources par le prélèvement direct sur le revenu des fonctionnaires, sur nous, ou bien sur la TVA. Et donc, il y a un effort à faire, un engagement soutenu pour explorer toutes les niches fiscales, permettre que toutes les activités soient taxables dans un souci d'équité fiscale et de justice. Et c'est là où il y a une différence entre les pratiques en Afrique et peut-être ici en Occident. Ici, nous parlons de solidarité. On parle d'un taux d'imposition pour les particuliers les plus riches. Ça n'existe pas en Afrique, ou bien très peu. Parce qu'une bonne partie de la population est pauvre, et puis il y a une classe moyenne sur laquelle on ne peut pas prélever un taux d'imposition assez important. Donc plus d'équité, de justice fiscale que de solidarité. Le quatrième principe, c'est, pour nous, je parle du Sénégal, l'équilibre de la balance commerciale. Avec le nouveau code des impôts qui a été adopté en septembre, des taxes ont été introduites pour limiter l'exportation de matières premières, de produits de base. L'arachide, par exemple, en fait partie. Parce que ce qui se passait jusque-là, des opérateurs étrangers venaient acheter à des prix incitatifs la production arachidière et l'exporter pour transformer cela en huile alimentaire. Et avec cette nouvelle taxe, le gouvernement ambitionne d'inciter ces opérateurs étrangers-là à créer des industries et à engager des activités de transformation sur place, à ajouter de la valeur. Une nouvelle taxe également a été introduite pour limiter l'exportation de l'anacarde, par exemple. Tout cela pour équilibrer notre balance commerciale et accompagner la politique gouvernementale pour ce qui est de l'agro-industrie et le développement industriel. Le cinquième principe, c'est accompagner la transition écologique. J'en ai presque pas entendu parler depuis ce matin. Ce n'est pas encore effectif, mais c'est à l'étude. Et courant 2026, nous allons imposer une taxe carbone. Nous allons imposer également une éco-contribution sur certains produits importés. Pour tous, pour augmenter les ressources de l'État. Le cinquième principe qui gouverne la politique, c'est une démarche vertueuse qui vise à protéger la santé des populations. Et depuis septembre, sont imposées au Sénégal des taxes sur le jeu du hasard. Le jeu du hasard. Et l'augmentation, il y avait déjà une taxe, mais on a augmenté à 70% la taxe sur la cigarette et l'alcool. Ça a généré beaucoup de bruit. Mais le gouvernement souhaite, par ces nouvelles taxes, protéger la santé des populations, réaliser des économies et réinvestir ça dans le tissu social, dans la construction d'hôpitaux ou d'écoles. Alors voilà donc les 5 principes, 6 qui encadrent la politique gouvernementale. Je terminerai par un point. On a beaucoup parlé de taxes depuis ce matin. J'ai très peu entendu parler de la mobilisation de l'épargne nationale. Oui, nos États peuvent augmenter le revenu en multipliant les appels à l'épargne nationale, en sollicitant des fonds sur le marché régional. Le diaspora bond, par exemple, a été une nouvelle expérience introduite par le Sénégal. Et ça marchait. Durant toute l'année 2025, avec 4 appels publics à l'épargne, incluant des diaspora bonds, le gouvernement est parvenu à financer son budget. Donc oui, il y a les taxes d'un côté, mais il y a aussi l'épargne. Et chercher à mobiliser l'épargne nationale peut permettre à l'État de récupérer peut-être des fonds qui naturellement devaient être récupérés sous forme de taxes, en mettant des taux d'intérêt incitatifs jusqu'à 6,5% sur une maturité assez longue, de 3 ans, de 5 ans, de 6 ans. Et c'est par ces différents mécanismes que le gouvernement du Sénégal travaille à la mobilisation des ressources domestiques. Merci, Madame.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. And you brought up a very important point about the flip side of the taxes and national savings, and also your point on the value added of production in Senegal. I think that's also an important point that hasn't been mentioned here this morning. So thank you very much. And to bringing this to a closure, we move to Colombia. Luis Fernando, Ambassador of Colombia, who is known for being very succinct in his interventions. Over to you.
Thank you, Raga. Well, I mean, I'm sorry. I've been shuffling around some of the ideas I had because I've learned so much in these presentations. So that I've kind of restructured my talk. I mean, I'm not saying something entirely different, but reorganizing the thoughts, especially. I mean, and I want to start with a point that was made by Professor Rota Graziosi, which is how the structural changes in developing economies have kind of failed to live up to the promise because of the increased reliance on indirect taxation and so on. And I think that Colombia, to a large extent, is a good example. The good news is we've been making progress in kind of raising our tax take gradually. Over the past 20 years, we've raised by 3%, more or less. We're already around the 19% of tax revenue per GDP as a ratio of GDP. But the problem is that these efforts have been halting because we're now in a cycle in which every government tries to launch a tax reform at the beginning. Then halfway through the term, it realizes that no, it was not enough, and so we need another tax reform, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I actually have some experience in this because I was part of the campaign team of the current administration, and we were very gung-ho about we're going to do the mother of all tax reforms. Finally, we're gonna get it done. We're going to do the big bang therapy in terms of tax revenue and so on. The tax reform was successful. I mean, I'm not saying it was a failure, but definitely it did not live up to what we expected. We expected to increase the tax take by maybe even 4%. No, that was not out of the question. But then what happened? Well, first of all, some of the proposals fell through in legislation. Others have been challenged in courts and so on and so forth. So there's a whole political economy quagmire behind all these efforts. And we're not the only ones. So there's no shame in that because every previous administration has failed in that. No? So I can very easily talk about it. It's not a problem. Everybody knows in Colombia that that's what happens. And it's like, okay, yeah, now we know. Okay, welcome to the club. Okay. So yeah. Now the problem is, why has it been so hard? And I think, of course, we share some of the features of what the ambassador of Benin was saying, ambassador of Senegal as well, which is a question of informality. Probably not to the same extent as in Africa, but definitely informal economies are huge in Latin America. So, first of all, that makes it very difficult to increase the size of the tax base. And so it's easy to say, well, increase the tax base, sure, but of course there's a lot of political questions of increasing the tax base in countries with very high inequality. How to do that in those contexts. Not to mention that there are parts of informality that do not have anything to do with the street peddlers and things like that, but questions of informality of land tenure, for example. We haven't talked too much about local taxes, but one of the big tax leakages we have in Colombia is about property taxes, because we have a major backlog in our cadastre and registry. So it's been very difficult to tax land, especially in municipalities, small municipalities. Basically, the Gini coefficient of the land tax is 0.95%, which is basically everything comes from 3 municipalities in Colombia, the 3 major cities. Most 95% comes from the 3 major cities, which means that in many municipalities they're just not taxing their land the way they should. And a lot of that has to do because we're just lagging behind in cadastre and registry and so on and so forth. So that right there's another part of informality that we are not picking up in our usual discussions about informality. But then to go back to the typical mainstream discussion about informality, I think the question is, it's been coming up in the conversation here, which is informality is in our countries is really deeply tied to the productive structure. I think that there are some activities of high complexity, high value added that you cannot do informally. You cannot be a successful exporter of high value added commodities if you're an informal producer. That's not going to happen. No? So informality in our economies, I think, is the outcome of productive structures that lack complexity, that lack value added, that lack technology, that lack insertion into world markets. And that's the breeding ground for informality. And I think that as long as we have our tax structures unable to transform that productive structure, then we are trapped in a cycle of low growth, low tax revenue, and therefore increased reforms, increased attempts at reform, more taxation, and so on and but frustrating efforts at tax reform. And that's rinse and repeat, basically. That's why in Colombia we've been having tax reforms every kind of 2 years, which of course means a lot of instability, lack of clarity, and so on. And of course, all these things go through the path of this resistance. Therefore, we have lots of tax benefits to certain firms, but not to others that are more politically vulnerable, and so on. So, yeah, I know. Am I not succinct? So yeah, basically, to wrap it up, I think we need to think of domestic resource mobilization in tandem, questions of reproductive structure and question of taxation, how to get the two to work in unison. And as long as we don't break that cycle, we'll keep trapped in this situation of chronicle tax reforms that don't live up to their expectation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and my apologies for giving you the evil eye, but that's my job here today. I really, if there is a burning question, I would welcome it, but preferably if it is directed not to all of them, because then I am going to give them, and I mean it, 30 seconds to say a final comment. Okay, a minute. So if there's a burning question, going once, twice, you're all so afraid of me, sorry. So that means you will each get a minute to reflect on what others have been saying or give an additional point, starting in the same order. The Ambassador of Benin.
Du coup, je vais répondre en français cette fois-ci pour mixer. Peut-être un premier clin d'œil à ce qui a été dit sur la question du cadastre. Un point très important qu'on n'a pas abordé, c'est qu'effectivement, pour être en capacité de renforcer la mobilisation des ressources domestiques, il y a aussi un gros travail en amont. L'exemple du cadastre en est un très bon. Il faut structurer les administrations, il faut aussi mapper l'ensemble du territoire pour savoir effectivement quelle est la base potentielle de collecte et pouvoir déployer les nouvelles typologies de taxes et s'assurer que nous avons tous les moyens de contrôle, entre guillemets, administratifs et en termes d'agents pour les collecter. Et c'est la même chose aussi pour les taxes au niveau individuel. Le Bénin a aussi développé ce qu'on appelle l'IFU, qui est un numéro fiscal unique et qui permet aussi de suivre l'ensemble des citoyens tout au long de leur parcours de vie, que ce soit sur des activités professionnelles ou que ce soit sur des activités de contributeurs simples. Et je voudrais peut-être faire un autre clin d'œil à ce qu'a dit mon collègue, l'ambassadeur du Sénégal. Je parlais de la Caisse des dépôts Bénin sur le fléchage et l'allocation des stocks dormants, et on peut être sur le côté investisseur institutionnel, stock d'épargne, de cotisation retraite, qui sont principalement aujourd'hui celles des fonctionnaires, et il faut élargir cette base. Mais il est effectivement critique de pouvoir avoir une structure qui soit en capacité de flécher ces fonds et qui soit aussi en capacité de développer de nouveaux instruments financiers, et notamment sur la collecte de l'épargne de la diaspora. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup. Much thanks, and going now to Chile.
Yeah, working. Well, I think another issue that is quite relevant in the case of Chile is that how we adopted the cyclical fiscal balance as a management rule. At the same time, there are moments or years where we're collecting a lot of resources that are going to be accumulated and managed under a very accurate financial discipline. So when we're talking about public debt in Chile, we have to think about pension funds. It's quite important. 50% of assets of pension funds are public debt issued in the last 30 years. So the stability of the financial management of that debt and the future debt, it's quite relevant, not only taking into account what are you going to finance as projects for development, but also to be sure that the stable pattern will remain to the future, because you need to ensure that the pensions in the future are going to be well financed and well valued. And on the other hand, when you're collecting and getting financial assets, well, the management of financial assets, it's not in the mind of public managers. They are always dealing with debt problems, but not with assets management. So you need to learn a lot about that.
Thank you very, very much, Ambassador. This is another interesting and important point. I think we have to have another event to follow up. Ambassador of Senegal.
Merci beaucoup. Mon dernier mot sera d'appuyer ce qu'a dit l'ambassadrice du Bénin. Les fonds dormants, qui sont en général les fonds de retraite, CDC, nous en avons. J'ajouterai les fonds souverains. Nous avons un qui réussit quand même à mobiliser beaucoup de fonds et qui sont des leviers de financement, des leviers de mobilisation de ressources domestiques pouvant être réinvestis dans le tissu économique. Donc c'est un domaine dans lequel peut-être l'OCDE et les États concernés qui ont une politique bien connue dans ce domaine pourraient davantage travailler pour renforcer un partenariat. Le dernier point, les flux financiers illicites. Ce qu'ils représentent en Afrique est énorme. Ils représentent plus que l'investissement direct étranger. Ils représentent plus que l'aide publique au développement, qui ne cesse de décroître. Je sais qu'il y a un mécanisme de coopération avec l'OCDE pour aider les États victimes de flux financiers illicites à pouvoir rapatrier ces fonds. Mais en amont, il y a le parcours de négociation de contrats très complexes, des contrats miniers dans le secteur des hydrocarbures très complexes, et que ne maîtrisent pas souvent les techniciens nationaux. C'est là où peut-être j'appuierai cet appel auprès de l'OCDE pour davantage se rapprocher des États africains, pour les aider à mieux négocier les contrats complexes en mobilisant des experts internationaux. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, and well noted. Ask to the OECD. We will make sure to follow up on that. Lastly, Mr. Succinct Ambassador.
Okay. Now, I mean, I'm probably just going to reiterate what I was just saying before, probably from the other side of the telescope, which is in Colombia we've been having this issue, which is it's a country engaged in serious efforts at decentralization, but we have not been able to make that flow of resources to retain some coherence. So we are actually, a lot of the tax revenues transferred to municipalities, earmarked for health, education, and sanitation, which is our lofty goals, but then with such lack of flexibility that there's hardly any resource left for actual investment. And to go back to my previous point, unless we're able to husband the resources, to change the productive structure, to actually increase the degree of industrialization and complexity in the economy, we're going to be trying to maintain a welfare state on a very fragile basis. So we need to have a more long-run view in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking the ambassadors very much for this fantastic discussion. And just in the interest of time, I would just ask you to remain seated. I am going to cancel my closing remarks and give the floor in a minute to Ambassador David Brooke, who will do the closing on behalf of all of us here. But I just wanted to reiterate the thanks to our partners, to UNU-WIDER and the University of Manchester, to all the speakers, to all the panelists, and to all of you, the 100+ who have been here throughout the event in the room, and 280 online participants. So we have been reaching out to a lot of people, and we see that the discussion is very important and timely, and we will definitely follow up. And before I give the floor to David, I also would like to thank the interpreters for their good service, for the Team Dev, Julia, Elizabeth, Renee, you know who you are, who have been putting this event together, Federico, and the whole team. Thank you very much, and over to you, David.
Thanks. Thanks very much indeed, Raga. And listen, thank you again to UNU-WIDER, to the University of Manchester, and indeed to all our really brilliant speakers and panelists for today's really, really interesting exchange. And I know I'm very conscious I'm all that stands between you guys and lunch, so I'll be very, very brief. I won't attempt to summarize. You know, I think it's been a really fantastic discussion. I mean, obviously coming through our issues around public trust, about institutional capacity, I suppose about the very central importance of domestic resource mobilization, but also I think hearing there a lot about partnerships and the importance of learning really across countries and regions. So I won't dwell on all those points because I think you've heard a lot about them already. What I do want to do in 2 or 3 minutes, if you bear with me, just really, really quickly, I think 2 things. One is just to talk a little bit, really, really quickly about a couple of the really, I suppose, concrete OECD contributions that can help really turn today's discussion into practical action. And then secondly, I suppose very important just to reaffirm our commitment here at the OECD to take this agenda, which is really, really important, forward. So first of all, I suppose we've heard a lot about data, as we always do in any good discussion at the OECD. It's a public good, and I think good data always drives better policy. And worth noting, I think, that through the Global Revenue Statistics database, the OECD is providing internationally comparable information on tax revenues for no less than 139 countries. So that's a really, really important tool. I just wanted to flag it because it is an important one, because measurement is not just a sort of a technical detail, but it's also, I think, the starting point for transparency and accountability and really credible reform, which is, again, is something we've been hearing a lot about today. Ultimately, I think, for me, listening to the wonderful panelists that we've had this morning, domestic resource mobilization is really about ownership. It's about building capacity, including through better data. It's about strengthening sovereignty, accountability, and the social contract between government and citizens. Secondly, the OECD is scaling up its capacity building for financing for development. We're very strongly engaged in the capacity building for financing sustainable development initiative, which is one of the Seville Programme for Action initiatives co-led by Italy and Kenya, supported by a number of other additional countries. And it's a really, really important, I think, initiative in bringing together practical support for public officials in key areas, including in taxation, sovereign debt management, innovative financial instruments, and the role of public development financing. Thirdly, we've heard a lot about this. I think we need to re-engage citizens and rebuild tax morale, and sustainable revenue systems, you know, as we've heard, can't rely on enforcement alone. They also depend on trust. That's a really, really key part of this. I think one of the findings that we heard a little bit about this morning, but when people were asked in Latin American, Asian and African countries, in 26 of those economies, whether the public services and infrastructure they receive were a fair return for the taxes that they pay, fully half said that they said no, essentially. So they didn't believe that that was the case. And I think that result tells us something pretty fundamental. So I think we have to work to close that trust gap. I mentioned the social contract between government and citizens. I mean, again, listening to our panelists and the discussion today, I mean, I think for me, when citizens see revenues translated into quality public services, trust increases, voluntary compliance improves, and then the domestic resource mobilization that we've been talking about today becomes sustainable. And it is that virtuous circle that I think Antonio was talking about at the beginning of the governance dividend that Kumal mentioned. And I would say that's true not just for African and Latin American countries that we've been talking about today, but also in my own country, for example, where compliance is relatively high, trust is relatively high, but you still see strains, because where there's a perception that, you know, costs relating to housing or education or energy are increasing, it's the same story. So this is something, again, getting back to what the OECD does best and the Development Centre does best. I think there's a lot here that we can learn from one another in this space. Just to conclude, and again, just to not to take too much time, with maybe 3 clear commitments from the OECD. Firstly, we will continue to provide high-quality data and evidence to support better policy decisions. Secondly, we will continue to invest in capacity building, tailored to country needs and really grounded in peer learning. And thirdly, we will continue to convene, exactly like today, partnerships and dialogue and further our work just as we've seen today. So look, before I close, a special word of thanks again to the Development Centre, to all the teams involved in today's great event, to the member delegates and partners, and all those, particularly those who've contributed on stage and joined the discussion from the audience. So thank you again, and see you all again soon, hopefully. Thank you.